did a good job. You even got Flynn to believe it. That's incredible. We have the transcript. It never happened. That's the power of misinformation. CNN misinformation. MSNBC misinformation. New York Times misinformation. Washington Post misinformation. Gaslighting is a fancy term for, again, lying often, and isolating people from the truth. How's that relevant? Well, I've been talking about this Flynn story all week. Here it is. You know, we showed you these 302s when Mike Flynn was interviewing with the FBI, and how Mike Flynn, General Mike Flynn, when he interviewed with the FBI, Mike Flynn was fired by the president because they allegedly talked about sanctions. Flynn mentioned sanctions. There's no mention of sanctions whatsoever. If you look at these 302s, Flynn, in his interview with the FBI, was talking about a separate issue, the expulsion of Russian diplomats. He never mentioned the sanctions on Russia. They were two separate things. Forgive me for the repeating this on the show, but it's important in terms of gaslighting. Here's 3021. If you flip around, here's the second one. You'll see expulsions comes up again. No mention of sanctions. Then you'll see in the third portion of the 302, the FBI summary, there's Flynn again talking about the expulsion of the Russian diplomats. Now, there are probably 150 million liberals in the country who still to this day are convinced that Mike Flynn lied to the FBI about sanctions on Russia when sanctions on Russia were never, ever discussed by the FBI. I had a fight with John Swan from Axios about this. It never happened. He talked about the expulsion of the Russian diplomats. Here's an article from the Daily Caller, an interview Mike Flynn gave right as this whole thing was coming down. Exclusive and final interview, defiant Flynn insists he crossed no lines and that leakers must be prosecuted. This is from 2017. Flynn even recognizes in the interview that he talked about the expulsion of the Russian diplomats and never the sanctions he was arrested for and fired for. Sounds like he was gaslit. Quote, Flynn said there was a brief discussion of the Russian diplomats who were being expelled by the Obama administration in retaliation for interference in the campaign. Here's Flynn's direct quote. It wasn't about sanctions. The conversation with the FBI, that is. It was about the 35 guys who were thrown out. So that's what it turned out to be. It was basically, look, I know this happened. We'll review everything. I never said anything such as we're going to review sanctions or anything like that. You want to see how powerful gaslighting is? How you can get people to believe in alternate reality, even though they know and suspect what you're telling them is false. Flynn never mentioned sanctions. That's a lie. Yet millions of Americans believe that. Flynn acknowledged shortly afterwards in an interview with the Daily Caller that he never, ever mentioned sanctions. He was only talking about the expulsions. Yet we recently saw these documents based on these new declassifications. And look at later on what Flynn tells the FBI after being bombarded by the media and everyone else telling him he lied about sanctions, even though I showed you the FBI's document. It's not true. It's totally a made-up story. Flynn himself started to believe it. Look at this. This is amazing. This is a Flynn interview he gave. We just got this. Flynn thanked him and said that they, the Trump administration, would look at everything once they got into office. Based on this conversation, he's talking about the conversation with the Russian ambassador, Flynn concluded that he must have discussed sanctions on the December 29th call, even if he could not specifically remember doing so. You see the danger of the society we live in right now? Where the media can invent an entirely false narrative with no evidence at all. The FBI's own documents prove Mike Flynn never, ever discussed sanctions, ever. We have a transcript of the call. Sanctions are never brought up by Flynn, ever. It's a fake story, 1,000%. And yet the gaslighting was so effective that Flynn himself, towards the end, starts to believe this fake story that he discussed sanctions with the Russian ambassador. Amazing. And not one person in the media will come out and defend this guy. Not one. Outside of maybe me and John Solomon and a few others, Hannity and others. No one in the mainstream media that's supposed to be fact-based journalists will come out and defend this guy and say, guys, that story we told America about Flynn lying about sanctions is obviously made up. You did a good job. You even got Flynn to believe it. That's incredible. We have the transcript. It never happened. That's the power of misinformation. CNN misinformation, MSNBC misinformation, New York Times misinformation, Washington Post misinformation.
You just heard Dan Bongino.